first shared their stories in caves, connected art, nature, and science, led us toward new horizons. Who thought to capture motion, spark an engine to life, turn television into a playground? Every day, you create the playful, the functional, and the unexpected. You break down walls and take us to astonishing places. Tell stories, leap borders, and create beauty for tomorrow. Because at Unity, we believe the world is a better place with more creators in it, where everyone has a chance to shape the world.
Good afternoon, our South APAC audience, if I can find my tongue and get it into the right gear today. Hi everyone, to our guests coming from India, Greater India region, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand and Pacific. And you can see that represented by the number of languages on the screen now. So welcome aboard everybody, great to have you. I'd love everyone right now to just drop into the chat message before we switch it off. Please let us know where you're calling from today, which country you're joining us from and city if possible. And we can see the wide variety of people who are joining us from this region. And while you're doing that, just some reminders for interaction during the webinar. We will turn the chat off shortly. All questions will need to go into the question and answer box if you are joining us from Zoom. If you are joining us from another streaming platform, you may proceed to put your questions in the chat for that platform. If you're joining us from Zoom also, please do not use the raise hand function. We do not use this in the webinar as we don't get people to speak live during the session. Just all questions in the Q&A box. That will be appreciated. Thank you. Unity is being used in a number of industries. It's not just being used for games, even though today's session is about creating 2D games. Our technology is being used in architecture, engineering, construction, automotive, transport, and manufacturing industries. Throughout education, it's also being used in the production of film and television all across the world. And with that, becoming a Unity certified user, associate, professional, expert, all the way up to instructor, gives you the ability and certification to be employed in any number of those industries we just mentioned. Some recent developments, if you joined us, you probably heard this a few times. We recently welcomed Weta Digital to the family. That's the company, multi-Academy Award-winning company, special effects company behind productions such as Lord of the Rings to the most recent Batman movie. And also we acquired Ziva Dynamics, who specialize in virtual state-of-the-art humans. But enough about me talking about this. We'll get Emma to give us a quick intro of who she is.
Hi, I'm a virtual human created by Ziva Dynamics. I'm powered by state-of-the-art biomechanical simulation, and I'm running in real time in Unity.
Well, a little bit of a lag there. Sorry about that, folks. We'll try and get that cleaned up for you for next week. There's a survey at the end of today's webinar. One of our lucky attendees will win a Unity swag pack. This will be for to qualify, you'll need to be a registered user. If you've joined us from an email link and you've already registered, don't worry, you're in the running. If you're joining us from any of the social media platforms on screen via a live stream, you'll need to scan this QR code now to register if you want to qualify for the swag pack draw. One person will win this, and we will draw it about 30 minutes after the webinar concludes today. And if you've missed this QR code, hopefully it's on the next screen. There it is. Here are some of our recent winners. If you've won in the last few weeks, there's a slight delay in this getting out due to COVID and some logistical issues, but don't worry, it is on the way to you if we've contacted you, so you can expect that soon. And just once again, the QR code is there for another second or two. Okay, that's it. So today we're in the second part of our building 2D games with Unity series, lights, camera, and should I say action? No, physics. Today with Sean, you're joined by Sean from Malaysia, myself, Jenny and Sarah, who are from the Singapore team, and also Tech, who's with us today from the Singapore team. And thanks to all of the people on my team who work tirelessly to bring this content together each week. And Sean, how you doing, buddy? Today's session is pre-recorded last night. Those of you who join us for these very regularly to optimize quality and video across such a wide region, we find this gives the best delivery for you. But Sean is with us today to answer Q&A. And
yeah, hi Andy, hi everyone.
All good. All right, well, with no further ado, let's get into today's session, and I hope you will enjoy.
Hello everyone, my name is Sean. I am a field engineer at Unity Technologies, and welcome to my webinar. Today's webinar, we're going to be covering how to build 2D games using Unity, and the topics today are specifically lighting, cameras, and physics. So today's webinar is actually two-part, the second part out of 3 parts in our series on building 2D games using Unity. If you haven't checked out the previous sessions, the previous session was done by Hector. If you haven't seen that, do reach out to us if you don't have the links to the previous video, and we'll be more than happy to hook you up with that. So for today's webinar, I'm going to be using a classic demo that's called the Lost Crypt. You can actually download this from the asset store for free. But today's session isn't actually a follow-along session, so I'm just going to basically demonstrate some of the key features in regards to lighting, camera work, and physics. So to get started, let me just show you how this project looks like by just jumping in and playing around with it. So here we are in Unity, and this is currently running the Lost Crypt demo. And on screen you can see our main character Sarah just walking from left to right. She's built with really simple locomotions to allow her to just walk around and jump. So I'm stopping here in this scene to just let you admire the beauty of this scene done by the talented 2D team. While it might not seem obvious, a lot of the texture work or the color variations are done using or achieved using the 2D lighting tool. So the variations of sunlight, like these spots on the walls, these are all done using the 2D lighting tool. As you can see, as Sarah goes into the crypt, her color and her mood changes based on the lighting. Right? She actually becomes dimmer because of the lack of light. It's also catching some of the light from the fire at the back. Once she's interacted with the altar, there's a cool thing that happens whereby the environment changes from light or from daytime to nighttime. And this is a great way to showcase more lighting features. So here she's acquired a torch in her hand, and as you can guess, the torch is a spotlight that helps her illuminate her environment. You can see it brings out more of the environment's details as she walks around. And the further she walks to the left, you can see some ghosts that are manifesting in the dark. And these ghosts are built using using custom shaders, using shader graph. But that's a topic for another day. So for today, I'm going to show you how you can set all this up. We'll be setting up the lighting, framing a scene with the camera, and also have a little fun with 2D physics. Right, so the first thing that we're going to do is frame the scene using Cinemachine. We're going to be starting the scene without any dynamic cameras, so as our character Sarah runs from left to right, you'll see that nothing is going to move. So we're going to add this functionality manually. So what we'll be doing is we're going to add 2 different cameras, have a trigger to trigger this camera swap so that the blending between cameras happen, and then we'll tweak a few things here and there. And now we're back in Unity. If I hit play and try to walk from left to right, you can see that nothing is happening to the camera. It's a really static camera, and we don't really get to see Sarah up close. So let's look at our hierarchy. So here we have our main camera, and that's what's responsible for showing us a scene. And I can move that around easily. And if I want to frame the scene in a different way, I could just duplicate that camera, right? And just move that around, zoom in closer, and that'll get us a different view of Sarah. And if I want to switch the scenes, I could just turn off the other camera and turn on the other one. Right, but that's a lot of manual work. You'd have to create some scripts or some animations to respond to the character's movements. So there's a better way to do this, and that's with using Cinemachine. And Cinemachine is a package, it's a free package from the package manager that you can import into any project. And this is exactly the tool we're going to be using to set up our camera framing. So to use Cinemachine, I'm just going to add a Cinemachine brain to the main camera. And this is the system that will be driving the movement of our camera and handle all the blending. Next, I'll need to define two cameras, and we're going to call these virtual cameras. And these virtual cameras basically act as proxies for where the camera should be, what are the framing settings, and how far it should be from the character, and what's its behavior like in relation to the character. So what I'm going to do is just select one of the cameras and add a Cinemachine virtual camera to it. You can see if I try to move the virtual camera around, it also forces our main camera to move. So it basically takes over the control of our main camera. So I can add another one to our near camera, which is our close-up of Sarah. So I'll just add another virtual camera there. And you can see if I turn that off, the far camera takes over and frames it in its own way. So it follows its settings, the main camera follows the settings of each virtual cameras. So to decide which virtual camera should take precedence, you can always tweak the priorities. Here, if I tweak it down, you can see the far camera takes over. And if I change this to 11, right, it will assume the position and the settings of the near virtual camera. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and tweak this so that we are zooming in closer to Sarah. We'll set this lens ortho size to 3. And that should give us a very close-up view of Sarah. Right, I'll just turn this off and then hit play. Right, so we can move left and right, and it hits a trigger, something happens, the near camera switches on and we are zoomed in. So what actually happened there? So there's a trigger already pre-set up in the scene. It's a really simple script called the object activator. So it's a custom script. And with this custom script, there's a box collider set to its trigger. And it has this huge box here that if Sarah passes through it, it actually executes this script that does something in the scene. And in this case, it's actually just turning on the near camera. So just to give you guys some context as to what's happening here, in the script, there are two built-in Unity methods called onTriggerEnter 2D and also onTriggerExit 2D. So once the character enters the collision box, what we're doing is we're checking whether or not the character actually matches the activator tag that's specified in the inspector. If she does, then we're basically running a for loop to enable all the objects specified in the list. And vice versa, if they happen to exit the collider, we can do the opposite of disabling the objects in the list. So that's what's basically happening to the near camera. So we actually check for the player over here, and we assign the near camera there. So you can see here the tag on our player is set to the player tag, so it checks out in our script logic. All right, and there is the near camera assigned in the objects list. So as we saw before, if I hit play and move again, you can see that the camera gets activated. It zooms in, looks at the character. But one thing's missing is that the cameras aren't actually following our character Sarah. Right, so you can actually add this logic quite easily by just using Cinemachine. So we can frame and follow our character by just assigning our character Sarah into the follow parameter in both our far and near virtual cameras. So there's a follow parameter there. I'll just pull Sarah in and assign it to follow. And the other thing we'll need to do is actually change this body setting to framing transform. And once you've enabled that, if you select any of the virtual cameras, you can see that there are regions of the camera space that are colored. So I'll explain what these are in a second, but let's look at what happens now. If I play the scene, you can see that the camera now follows Sarah, even in its zoomed in near camera. And there are these regions in your screen space to define how the camera should actually respond to our character. So what we just enabled earlier was something called the framing transposer, and that really basically helps you follow the specified target of your choice. And there are two special regions that are defined here that you need to tweak to control this behavior. One is the dead zone, which is a zone within the blue area, and then the soft zone, which is the blue area itself. What this basically defines is that the camera would not actually start to move until the character actually exits the dead zone area. Once it's entered the blue soft zone, the camera would then start to follow based on certain settings defined in the inspector of the virtual camera. So let's go back to scene and see how this works. So there's one thing that's actually tied to the character. Once you've assigned this framing transposer, there's a bright yellow dot associated with this character. And what this is basically the pivot point of the tracked object. Now, we wouldn't want to track her feet. That would actually be weird. Usually when you look at a person, you look at their face. So what we can do is actually move this up and offset the tracked object's pivot point up to her face. So we're looking at the proper point of interest. And next, what we can do is actually move our scene around, or actually the framing of our camera around, by just clicking on the yellow dot and just dragging around. And this really just changes the settings of your soft zone. And what I'm going to do is also kind of widen the dead zone so that we don't immediately follow the character as he or she walks around. Right, so I'm just gonna widen that a bit. So the reason why you want to keep the dead zone a little wider is so that you don't make the camera too responsive. It sounds like a bad thing, but if the camera is just flying around left and right based on just the most smallest of movements from your character or your controller, it's going to make the game feel a bit jerky, and it's not really an ideal experience. So you want to give some slack to the movement or the follow or the camera follow. So here I'm going to just move the pivot point up a bit so that the pivot points her face and not her feet. We can angle this a bit so that we see more of the environment instead of the grass on the floor, because the star of the show is really the trees in the background, right? We can also shift it a little bit to the left so we see more of the environment forward in front of Sarah. Right, I'm going to widen our dead zone width and height. And you can see when she jumps, if the dead zone is a bit tight, when we jump, or when the player jumps, you can see that the camera will immediately follow. So this might not be ideal, especially in a platformer, because if the camera follows you up, you won't be able to see the platform that you're intending to jump on the ground. So if we widen this dead zone higher, you can see the camera will be a lot steadier in a sense. So your camera will be more working for your player rather than working against it. Okay, so now we're able to move left, move right, and have the camera only follow us if we exit the dead zone. And if you've noticed, there's this really ugly cutoff on the left side. If I try to walk to the left, there's an invisible wall that's blocking Sarah over here. And what we should actually do is actually confine the camera within a limited bounding box so that it doesn't go out of the scene. So you can achieve this by adding an extension to the virtual camera called the Cinemachine Confiner 2D. And in this component, you can assign it a bounding box that's already previously pre-set up already. So I'm just going to select that, the camera bounds. You can see the camera is immediately shifted, and it will try to be confined within this space that's predefined. So if I try to move to the left now, it stops over there. And even in my close camera, my nearby camera, the close-up, it's also being confined there. And if we look at this, I'm going to zoom out, select the bounds, and just visualize the box collider. You can see it's just really a simple box collider 2D that defines where the camera should stay within. Right, so it's just as simple as adding a confiner extension. And next, we're going to be setting up the lighting in the scene. And for this next part, I'm going to start with a scene with barely any lighting set up, so it's going to be really dark. And what I'm going to do is just apply the various different lighting techniques just to bring out the texture, shape, and definition of the sprites in our scene. So there are 4 different light modes in Unity 2D lighting, the first of which is the simplest global light 2D, which basically lets you target a layer of the scene and light it uniformly. So here we are in the dark, unlit scene, and what I'm going to do is just give you a little tour of the place. You can see it's really dark. All the trees have no lighting on them, and we're going to just slowly shape the environment, paint the entire scene with lighting. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is let's just inspect the hierarchy. There is a game object called Light Global Ambient, and I'm just going to add in a light 2D component here. Be careful not to select the light component, that's the 3D lighting. So the 2D lighting component is specifically has the suffix 2E at the end of it. So what you want to do is switch this over to global, and you can see nothing actually happens yet. So what you need to do is change the target sorting layer to target a specific set of sprites. Right, so I'm going to select the near background, which involves all the trees in the back, and also include maybe exterior and also the grass, which is inside the foreground layer. Okay, you can definitely separate this if you want to tint or light up the grass a little differently. You can do that. So just lower down the intensity here, about half. Okay, and you can see the scene's already nicely lit up with some fill light. And next I'm just going to add in some color into our fill light, just to reflect the environment around it. And next up, I'm going to just paint parts of the scene using the Freeform Light 2D. And this basically lets you create any shape to light specific areas of the scene. So you can see here, this exterior part of the crypt is unlit. So I just want to create a shape that only light up parts of the crypt, because the light shouldn't penetrate all the way into the crypt itself. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new light 2D and set it to freeform mode. And what I'm going to do is just click on edit shape, and this will allow me to actually drag the points of the shape around just to define the section or area that I want to light up or paint. Right, so this looks pretty good enough, right? I just want some parts of it to be lit up. There are some parts that will be left in shadow. And what I'm going to do is, of course, set a target sorting layer. Okay, should be cave. All right, so that'll lit up part of the crypt here. And what I'm going to do is, of course, tweak the intensity to be a little lower so it's not too bright. And of course, add some sunlight hues to the mix. Okay, we can also tweak the fall off. So this will determine how soft the fall off will be. If I set it to 0, and so if you look at it right now, you can see the edge of the light here is quite harsh, but you can always tweak the fall off to make it a lot softer and just control how it fades away and blends into your environment. Next up, we're going to use the same freeform lighting tool to light up the top part of all these trees over here. So if I look into the hierarchy, you can see under forest, there should be a tree tops game object, and it's really just empty. I'm going to add a light 2D component to it and select freeform. And of course, we'll edit the shape, zoom out a little bit, and just shape this all around the top parts of the trees, just the top parts of the trees. So this is going to be just like, imagine sunlight hitting only the top part of the trees, right? So I'm just going to take some time and shape this a bit. Right, so this doesn't have to be even. We're going to use the fall off that we just used earlier to just fade this off nicely. And because the canopy of these trees aren't even at all, we can introduce a little bit of randomness to it. So I just dropped off all the dots that I want to move, and just shift it around to make it seem or feel as organic as can be. Okay, just give me some time to tweak the top parts of the freeform lights. We should be about done. Yeah, that looks good enough. Okay, so let's tweak the lighting, add some sunlight hues to the mix again. And of course, set the target sorting layers to the nearest background. And it's a little harsh, so I'm going to tune that down and maybe increase the fall off a little bit. And keep adjusting the fall off strength just to get the right amount. And yeah, that looks good. It's just missing a little bit of something there. Okay, so that's how you light up the top part of your trees, but it is looking a little bit flat. So it's missing something. Now, what we can do is in the same lighting 2D setting, there's a blend style that we can change from default to direct lighting R. And this direct lighting R is a custom blend mode that we actually defined in the render pipeline. And immediately you can see there's a difference here. It has a little bit more contrast to it. And what's actually happening is, well, if you look at the sprite editor, we have this tree is really made up of all these small little foliage bushes, and each of these foliage comes with a secondary texture. If you look at the secondary texture, it comes with a normal map and a masked texture attached, and it comes with this really funky pink shading on it. But why is it this funky pink shading? So I'm gonna just take some time and explain to you what this really means. If we look at the actual texture itself, it's actually made up of course, like any texture, red, green, and blue. And if you look at the red channel, you can see that only the top part of the foliage is colored in red, whereas the bottom part is a lot darker. And this will start to make sense in a while once I've explained how the custom blending mode works. And in addition to the mask texture, you also have the normal map, which helps bring out details and give shapes to your sprites by changing how the light interacts with the texture underneath it. So you can see here as I move a spotlight around the rocky surface, it actually gives shape to the rocks based on the normal map. And so back to what our custom blending mode actually does. It actually works in tandem with our mask texture to only allow certain parts of the sprite to be lit by the 2D lighting. So if you head over to your 2D renderer pipeline settings, you can actually set your light blending styles. In here, we're giving it the name direct lighting, have it interact with the mask texture channel R, which is red, and then have the blend mode set to multiply. And for those of you who aren't familiar with blend modes or how shaders work, I'm going to try and demystify it here. So it's actually helpful to just think of the red channel as a black and white texture, because that's basically what it is. It's actually just a mask. So a mask is something that's either a black and white, it's a yes or no, it's either visible or it's hidden. So white here, if you look at the texture on the right, let's say if white represents a value of 1, which is the maximum value of the texture, and black represents 0, which is the smallest value of that texture. If you were to apply a multiply operation to it, that's to say we just multiply the color of the texture with another input. And in this case, we are multiplying with the light source. So say our light source has the intensity of 2. If the light source multiplies with the white parts of the image, you would get a value of 2. The output would be 2. Inversely, if you multiply with the black parts of the image, you would get a value of 0, right? Because anything multiplied with 0 is 0. So if you look at the texture on the right side, you'll notice that the black parts here represent parts of the image that are hardly lit by lighting. They're cracks and crevices that are difficult for light to penetrate or reach. Hence, it's much darker. And if we see this applied in the scene, you'll notice that those crevices actually retain their darker tonal values, hence giving the entire scene more structure, more contrast, and just overall looks much better than a flatly lit surface. And so if we come back here again and switch our blending mode back to R, you'll notice that only the top parts are lit and the shadowed areas keep their darker tonal values, giving the foliage its contrast, right, as opposed to having a flatly lit sprite. And of course, just to show you again, I'm going to open up the render data 2D and show you how you can actually just change the blending style to whatever you want. You can change the direct lighting naming, or just change which channel you want your lights to interact with, and of course your blend mode. And next we're going to look at how we can light the scene with the Sprite Light 2D component. So the Sprite Light 2D component is helpful to give shape to your lights based on texture that you assign to it. So for example, you could use a flashlight texture to actually give some shape to your spotlight instead of just having a clean radial gradient. So you can also use this to add richer texture and color to your scene by painting the environment with specific shapes. So let's see how this works in scene. So what I'm going to do is just look in the hierarchy once again. There are a couple of transform game objects already in the scene here, and they're all called sunspots. I'm just going to select all of them and apply the same 2D light component to all of them. Right, and then I'll swap this over to sprite mode and select the appropriate texture. It's going to be sunspot 2. And next, of course, you see that it doesn't really affect anything, so I'm going to assign a target sorting layer to it. So it's going to be exterior and foreground, as well as the near background. And like what we did before with the foliage, of course, I'm going to give it a blending style, because some of these tree trunks, they actually have some masks on them. And then just tone this down a bit because that grass is a bit too bright. Okay, and actually some of these components here, or actually some of these game objects here, are meant to have a different texture. So I'm just going to swap this out from sunspots 2 to sunspots 3. And I'm going to tweak the intensity of sunspot 3s a little bit differently. Just intensify the color or the light of these sunspots on the tree trunks and the tree leaves. Right, so as you can see, that just adds a little bit of variety to the textures of the seed, on the grass, and the environment. Of course, next, you can also use this as quote-unquote volumetric light shafts. So in here, there are a couple of light shaft game objects. I'm going to assign a sprite light 2D to it, and then look for shaft 1 texture. And then assign it a couple of target layers. The foreground. Make sure to set the blending. And finally, of course, enable the volumetric intensity. So this is quite intense, so I'm going to lower this down a little bit. And of course, change it to have a bit of sunlight hues. That should be just right. And then, of course, vary the texture a bit, change shaft 1 to shaft 2. And you can see things are starting to look a little bit more majestic. And lastly, we're going to look at the final mode, which is the Spotlight 2D light type. So this allows you to create a 2D spotlight with a robust fallout control, and also allows you to cast shadows on any object with a shadow caster. Okay, so let's look at how we can set this up. I'm going to go into the crypt now, and you can see there's an altar there with a tiny little hole conveniently placed on top of this altar. So what I'm going to do is actually just find that game object. It's going to be inside the lights crypt cave hole 1. Okay, we'll just create the new light 2D. It's automatically by default set to spot, so just keep it at that. And then just go into the inspector, set the proper targets first so we can actually see the shape of it. So this is going to be cave. And then we can start to move this around and tweak it in the scene. So I'll move it closer to the hole and change the angles of the spotlight. Right, make it a cone instead of radial. Shine it down onto the altar and then tweak the fall off. Okay, intensify it, change the colors. And that's our spotlight. All right, cool. Let's change the fall off anytime just to get the right amount of sunlight into this environment here. And of course, let's respect the masks on the environment, as well as the normal map of our tiles behind. Right? So immediately you can see there's so much more depth being brought out into the scene. A bit of volumetric light, just to simulate fog in the environment. And finally, let's have some fun applying some shadows on this altar here. Okay, I'll look for the altar, and then add a shadow caster 2D component, edit the shape, and I'm just going to do a really rough edit. You can see that when I lift up this point, there's a sharp shadow that's being cast down. So just match the shape of the altar really quickly. Right, it's not too important, but just to add a little subtle effect to the scene. Okay, so this, you can actually tweak the strength of the shadows from your light source itself. Okay, let's try to not make it too harsh. Yeah, here you can see the shadows are a lot harsher when you're closer to it. The contrast is much more apparent when the light source is closer. And the one last setting in your 2D lights is the overlap operation. And this basically controls the way the selected light interacts with other rendered lights. So here's an example. We have two modes, one additive and one alpha blended. On the left side, you see the additive blend mode. The two lights basically merge their colors together. They add on their values into one value in the middle. Whereas in the alpha blended mode, the light source with the higher sorting order will be the more dominant color in that space. In this case, that's red. And finally, we're going to take a quick look at 2D physics. We're going to add a little bit of collisions, triggers, and gravity to the mix, just to allow us to access a secret area in the scene. So here we are in another scene where we're going to allow Sarah to climb up these debris here to access a secret area on top. So let's see her try to get up there. So if I play the scene, you can see that nothing is really set up just yet. If I try to jump on this debris, nothing happens. There's nothing for her to step on. All right, so we actually have to attach or assign a collider down there along the sprites so that she can jump on top of them. So I've prepared a few transforms game objects here, and what I'm going to do is just reassign a 2D box collider, change the collider shape here. Okay, let's find it over there. There's that square. So I'm going to edit that collider shape, pull that down to match the size of the sprite. So this will kind of define the form of the physical shape of that collider. So it doesn't have to follow exactly the entire rock or the entire slab there. And you can see I can jump on it, but I also cannot walk through it. Right? Sometimes you want to be able to walk through it, but also jump on top of it. Now there's a cool little technique that you can do, and that is to attach a platform effector 2D. And what this will allow you to do is let you walk through it from a certain angle. Now for this to work, we have to check on used by effector on the box collider 2D. And from here, also tweak the surface arc. I'm going to set it to 150 so that Sarah will be able to walk through it. And she's also able to jump through it and land on top of it. Okay, because I'm in play mode, I'm going to copy this before I stop the game and then reattach that component so that I retain all my settings from before. And also remember to set use by effector on top. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and keep on laying the pathway for Sarah to reach the top. So I'm going to apply the same component, the box collider, on the second slab here. And as you can see, you can also rotate the collider. Right, we'll attach the same platform effector 2D to it, and yeah, make sure use by effector is on, and we can immediately test this out. So Sarah's still able to walk through it, and she's able to jump to the next slab. And as you can see, there are a couple more platforms that we need to set up. So let's get to that. I'm going to add another collider. And from this list, you can actually see there are a couple of different choices that you can use. And there's also two variants to each collider. It's a box collider and box collider 2D. So because we're making a 2D game, make sure you only select the box collider or only the 2D collider variants, because the other ones are meant for 3D games. So in this case, we need to define something more complex. So I'm going to use the polygon collider 2D. And this basically allows us to define a complex shape like how we've been doing with the freeform 2D lighting component. Right, so I'm just going to sculpt this and arrange all the dots just to match the shape of our sprite in the background, right? I'm also going to create a tiny little slope. I'm not going to follow the sprite exactly. I'll make a little slope so that the player doesn't have to jump over this, because it's only blocking her toe. I wouldn't want it to feel like this is like a huge impedance to her physical ability, right? Okay, I'm going to create another platform effector in case the player wants to jump and not have his or her head bump on this invisible collider here. And also another one just for this last set of platforms here to allow a player to jump to the finish. Okay, just make sure I fill all the gaps so they don't accidentally fall down. Yeah, that's an overlap there. So perfect. Okay, so let's go. Second jump, third jump. Okay, I can walk up that slope, and fourth jump, and I'm at the finish. Right, so I've arrived at the secret area, and it also has a shade. I've also created a nice shade to block out the sunlight, and you can see once he passes this area, something is actually supposed to happen. I've actually placed a trigger there to create some rocks to fall out from the rooftop, but they haven't actually been falling down. So I'm going to investigate what's happened here. So these are basically spawned by this trigger box over here. It's the same object activator that we had for the camera earlier. And what this does is it just turns on a group of rocks on top. Right? These rocks have a polygon collider 2D that matches the shape of the rock, but it doesn't have a rigid body 2D, so I'm going to assign one here. And as soon as I assign that, you can see the rocks just fall to the ground because it has gravity turned on by default. If I set it to a different type, body type, like static, for example, or kinematic, it wouldn't be able to fall to the ground. So you need to keep your rigid bodies dynamic, right? So just add a rigid body 2D, and instantaneously you'll have a physics-enabled body. Okay, so just jump up, run past it, you can see they start to fall to the ground, but it doesn't feel quite as natural as it should be, right? Because the rocks just come to a full stop. Now what you can do is actually assign a physics material to the rigid body, and that determines how bouncy or how sticky that particular rigid body can be. So you can do this by going to your project, create, and we'll look for the physics material. So maybe under 2D physics material, there it is. You can go ahead and create that, and what you'll get is this little object with a green icon that lets you define the physics, friction, and bounciness. So if I had mine set at 0.3, you just assign that to your rigid body 2D, and let's see how this looks. Okay, if I pass it, see the debris drop to the ground and they bounce off the ground. and going to the secret area triggers another invisible box collider, and that's the end of the webinar. So today we've managed to cover framing the scene with Cinemachine, setting up the 2D lighting, and also a little bit of 2D physics. And with that, we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure to have you guys here. If you need to reach out to me, my email contact information is on the screen right now. And I hope to see you guys next week, where we'll cover the third part of our 2D game webinar series. So tune in for that. I'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, Sean. What an awesome presentation again from the field engineering team. Sean, I'm just going to get you to take a look through the Q&A questions to find the best question relevant for today's session. If anyone else still has some questions on today, you've got a minute or so to get them into the Q&A box. So we can get you qualified for that, or if you're not interested in qualifying for that and you still want to know the answer, please do so. And just a reminder, Sarah, if you can put up the slide for the prize pack. Just a reminder that in the chat box is now the survey link for today's webinar. We'd love to hear your feedback on the session, whether you like it, whether it's interesting, was it useful for you, and any other topics that you may wish us to cover in future weeks. Your feedback helps us to produce better content for you. And one of the lucky registered attendees today will be in the draw for a prize pack, which will happen about 30 minutes after the webinar will be drawn. So please click on that link now. And is there any questions that you think field engineering team that you may want to repeat live that may be of benefit for the entire group? Or any other questions in the Q&A now that you would like to answer live? FE team?
Well, it's quite a lot of questions. I'm having a hard time actually finding a good one.
No problem. That's fine. We'll leave that with you for a minute. Tech, if you're with us, are there any questions you see in there that may be a benefit for the whole audience that you may want to recap on?
Good question. Yeah, it's kind of digging through right now.
No problem. Just bear with us, folks. If you are drawn for the best question for today's webinar, we will need you to stay on the line. I will drop you a PM if you are the winner to get your email address to arrange delivery. And there's still a few more questions coming through. And just for our attendees, Jenny and Sarah, if you just make sure the chat is re-enabled. A question for the attendees for today. I have re-enabled chat, not for questions, just for this particular question I'm going to ask you now. Would any of our attendees be interested in our next webinar series, similar to the one we're doing on 2D, which is a three-part series on producing a 2D game? We're looking at doing a couple more of these series in the coming months, and we're thinking about giving away kind of a cool prize, maybe like an iPad for the best finished production. If you think that would be interesting for the audience and it's something you would participate in, please indicate in the chat box now. Excellent. A few responses coming through there.
I've got a quick one over here. There's a question here about the maximum light intensity for any type of light source. So this one's kind of interesting because the 2D lighting doesn't have support for like HDR, so it, like greater than one type of lighting. There is there's a setting in, I think it's in the project settings under 2D lighting, where you can essentially set a multiplier for the fake HD lighting. I think that's what we call it, fake HDR lighting. And this allows you to set lighting, or you can set the light colors or intensities greater than 1. So it kind of fakes like an HDR sort of lighting, but there's no sort of native HDR support.
Thanks, Tech. And Sean, do you have a winner for us? The name of the person? Under pressure.
Oh, this is
Sorry, buddy.
Yeah, totally under pressure. There's so many good ones. Tech, do you have any good questions, or was that your pick?
I don't know. I think that was, I don't know if that was the best one, but it was a pretty interesting one.
All right, let's take that one as the winner. Who does that belong to? Tech?
Let me see. Wait, let me see. Now I gotta find it because I set it to answer live. Where is it?
Just the first name, and I'll find the participant.
Where is it? Where is it? Okay, it was Ishak Zian.
Sorry, first letter?
ISHHAQ.
Got it. Messaging you now. Ishak, you should have a message from me now. Please respond with your email address in the chat window to me. And once we've got that, if you've got any other questions you want to answer there, folks, I have your email address. Thank you. Excellent. Are there any more questions to answer, team?
Yeah, that's quite a lot of questions regarding the platform effector. So the platform effector, if you've played any classic video games like Contra or Mario, for example, there are some platforms that you can jump through and still stand on. So the platform effector that we're using here basically allows the main character Sarah to actually pass through it if you're walking through it in a certain angle, but still allow you to still stand on it if you come from the top or another different angle.
Okay, we might conclude today's session. Is there still some more that you want to answer, guys? We have a little bit of time, but I will take your cue, FE team. Wow, quite a few questions, okay.
It's quite a bit. Some of them are repeats that we've answered before.
Yeah, I think there's one question that shows up 3 times right now, but if there's a light source behind the trees and there's a transparent hole in the tree, will the light source pass through the tree? So not exactly. I mean, if you've got the light behind the tree, so that means like further away in Z from the camera. If, for example, it's volumetric or it's lighting up something behind the tree, you'll see the lighting. You'll see what the lighting is affecting behind the tree, but it won't bleed through the tree like towards the camera. So if you would, for example, if you would like to have something like, let's say, God rays coming through like a hole in the tree, you would actually put the light in front of the tree, and have like a sprite light or something where it looks like there's God rays coming, sort of emanating out from that hole.
There's a question about how do we make the particles, like the bugs in the scene, in the upper above the grass. Yeah, so yeah, they're really exactly as you described. They're basically particles with an additive shader on it. I believe it's just a blurry, blobby texture with just an additive shader. You can get that glow on top of it from post-processing bloom.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it's sort of like the 2D lighting is that you actually don't even need the bloom, because if you're using like a soft texture, that essentially becomes your bloom.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about the character moving is made of many sprites. If you use shadow for the moving character, would it reflect on individual sprites? Yeah, actually, there is. So you saw the shadow caster that we used for the altar. There's also an option to self-shadow. So you can have your various different parts of your character's body shadow itself as well. That's a good question. Can some of the logic of the game be built in another platform, Python logic controller passing across to the game for the character? Yeah, you could build your own Arduino controller. Alternately, your game logic exists in Unity, so it's all either C# or you can use visual scripting for your game. How to add shadow on the floor, because you see only shadows on the character. I think what you saw earlier was that the character was not lit. So if you want to simulate shade on the floor, basically you start off the scene without any shading on any color at all, any lighting at all. And the shade that we actually see in the scene, it's just the absence of light, right? So if you tuned in during the session where we actually set up the sprite lights, it's the sprite lights that determine which part of the entire texture gets lit. Right? So you can use Sprite Light 2D for that.
There's a question here about changing 2D physics materials via script. So in this, like this would really be just like changing any properties on, well, on any mono behavior. So as long as you have a reference to the 2D, as long as you have a reference to the 2D physics material, you can change its properties. So that would be things like friction, bounce and restitution. If you mean changing out the material, so you have a few pre-built materials like bouncy and ice, or something, then you just have a reference to the physics, sorry, to the rigid body 2D, and then you would basically swap out the physics material just using that property. I forget what the name of the property is. Probably just physics material.
Maybe just one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. If anyone has questions that they would really still like to know the answers to, please email us at the Unity events email address that you would have received on your invitation email. And also, please feel free to go to unity.com. Okay, with no further questions, you good, Sean, to wrap up?
Yeah, well, I can follow up with this question right here about how do we make the characters move. That's something we'll be covering next week. We'll be rigging our characters, setting up the body parts, and making controls for animating your character as well.
Awesome. So don't forget to join us next week for the third and final part of the 2D game series. And thank you very much for staying with us today and joining us each week. And we look forward to seeing you next Friday all across South APAC. Thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon.